It's Monday. Tonight is the home run derby. We're not going to do a normal This Week in Baseball in front of tomorrow's All-Star game. Instead, we've got an all-star author that's going to join us, Chris Jensen, who wrote a book, Baseball's Two-Way Greats, Pitching and Batting Stars from Ruth and Rogan to Ohtani. And we're going to have a great conversation with Chris and hope you'll stay with us. Thanks.
We are very happy to welcome author Chris Jensen to the podcast today. He has written a wonderful book called Baseball's Two-Way Greats, which for me was a very, very interesting exploration of a lot of players I had never heard of before, because two-way players sort of stopped long before I was ever born. So welcome, Chris, to the podcast. We're super happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Gordon and Mark, and I'm delighted to be with you here today.
It was interesting to me because the very first thing that I thought, and this was something that was answered pretty early on in the book, thankfully, is what really defines a true two-way player? Because for the longest times, we did have pitchers that batted. There were even some pitchers that were considered good hitters. But where was, sort of the dividing line between what was a pitcher that hit and a true two-way player? And you had set it up in your book that it was somebody that had 200 plate appearances in a season and 10 pitching appearances in a season. And what surprised me was how many people that actually ended up being that qualified under that metric.
Well, there weren't very many that qualified that weren't a 19th century player or a Negro League player. And that's really what makes, I think, Ohtani a unicorn and Babe Ruth a unicorn. But the genesis of the book was, since Ohtani has come to all the success in the majors, every time you watch a game with him or you read an article about him, the announcer or the writer feels compelled to say the first two-way player since Babe Ruth. And I keep saying, no, no, no. And after about the 50th time, I'm like, well, I'm just going to prove how wrong they are. And I knew from my previous writing that there was a lot of Negro League guys that were two-way players. And I had a sense that there were a lot of 19th century guys, but there's really been 336 players that meet that standard of 200 plate appearances and 10 pitching appearances, and almost all of them came from the 19th century. Now, I will say the Negro League players, because a lot of their games don't count because they weren't considered major league caliber, they fall short when in actuality they were playing 200 games, and all of these guys were meeting those qualifications. You go to Seamhead's Negro League database and their stats don't really show that they were the two-way players that we're seeing Ohtani do now and that we saw Babe Ruth. So anyway, that was why the book came about. I wanted to prove those guys wrong.
Chris, I think also I want to hear what you have to say when it comes to the Negro League players. To fill a roster, you had to have two-way players because you just didn't have that many players necessarily on a Negro League team roster like you did necessarily, and even in the major leagues in those days. So everybody had to kind of do two things a lot of the time, or at least more than one player.
Well, that's exactly right, Mark. I think the average Negro League team had 13, 14. If they were lucky, they had 15 guys, and it could change at any given time. I mean, Satchel Paige was always, if he had a cell phone, it would have been even worse, but I don't know how people got a hold of him. But, he'd be gone, and you think he was going to be pitching the doubleheader, and he'd be playing for someone else. And so everyone not necessarily was also a pitcher, but they had to play multiple positions on a Negro League roster. And Ted Double Duty Radcliffe became famous for he'd pitch the first game of a doubleheader and he'd catch the second game. So, but a lot of those guys had to do that. When Bullet Rogan wasn't pitching, he was playing center field and batting in the middle of the lineup. And they didn't think it was anything special. Someone had to do it. So they had a lot of games to play and a lot of innings to fill.
This is the only way, you needed a center fielder for the games, and you only had so many guys on the roster. You didn't have the luxury of having a guy that would be like, no, all he does is pitch. We don't have him play the field. He just only comes in to pitch.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and Bullet Rogan, whether he was playing center field or pitching or second base or wherever he's probably the best player on the field in every game. No matter where he was playing. I think that's something going to this book. I kind of knew he was a good player. I knew he was in the Hall of Fame. I had no idea how good he was. And I think that's one of the players I came away with the most respect for from the research for this book, was just how spectacular a player Bullet Rogan was.
And that's something that really set him apart reading the book, was that he was a triple threat. Not only was he a great batter and a great pitcher, he was also really, really good in the field, which is something that even Ohtani can't claim. He's not a guy that ever plays the field.
Yeah, and I think it's always unfair to do a comparison between Babe Ruth and Ohtani and from different eras, and obviously Ohtani's only DHing when he's not pitching, but I think it's more fair to say, how is Ohtani compared to what Rogan was doing back in the day when Rogan was playing, 200 games a year, and when he wasn't pitching, he was playing center field. He was always batting in the middle of the lineup. And when I look at his stats for his career, you have to keep in mind he missed the first 9 seasons of his career because he was in the Army. Now, he was playing baseball in the Army for the 25th inventory records, but I mean, his stats from the Negro Leagues didn't start kicking in until he was 26. So, he compiled some pretty amazing stats, and he was just a solid everyday player. You could rely on him in any position.
And the respect he had from his teammates, I think, and the stories they told about his exploits, I think, are as important to understanding how good he was, because you don't have the historical records to the degree that you do for the other players.
Yeah, I mean, you have a number of his peers that said he was a better pitcher than Satchel Paige, and that's high praise indeed. And he was also a manager. I mean, he was a manager for the Monarchs in the later stages of his career, and I think if you look at all the games, if you look at the barnstorming games and the exhibition games, I mean, I think he won over 350 games. He had over 2,000 Ks as a pitcher, but he also had 2,500 hits and over 350 home runs as a hitter. So I don't know that Ohtani's going to pile up those sorts of stats. I mean, I think Ohtani's going to certainly have the hitting stats. It's still uncertain how much he's going to be able to pitch over the rest of his career, and I think that's really how he's going to be judged as a two-way player, is how much more can he pitch for the rest of his career. If it's like every other year, kind of like he's been doing, I'm sure it'll be pretty amazing, but he may not pitch much more past this year.
I wonder if they can convince him to be a closer.
Well, it's I think
There'd be a
if he was going to have problems pitching, the more interesting thing would be if he'd turn him into like a right fielder or a first baseman, because I think he could be really good at that. He'd probably be a great fielder if you knew he wasn't going to be pitching. But yeah, if you could just get him, once a week as a closer for an inning or two, I think most managers would sign up for that. I mean, that's essentially what he's doing now. He's pitching the first inning or two until he can get built up. And, if he's throwing 101 miles an hour, whether it's the first inning or the ninth inning, I think that's, it's pretty impressive.
He's already given up stealing the bases like he did, last year. I think he proved the point, and that might make him somewhat unique amongst two-way players, right? To have that aspect of his game in addition. Although some of the older players, and I want to talk a little bit about John Montgomery Ward, because there's a guy who stole some bases as well as a two-way player. But being able to steal that many with the home runs going along with it at the same time, that was a pretty remarkable achievement for Ohtani.
Yeah, exactly. I think no one had any idea that he was capable of stealing 50 bases. Everyone knew he was fast. I think one of his early years, he was clocked as the fastest base runner to first base throughout the course of the year, which, I mean, he's a large guy. So that's something that kind of stands out. But I mean, a 50-50 season, I mean, that's just incredible. And I think
Yeah.
he's already got 12 stolen bases this year, even, kind of saving himself for pitching later. So, he continues to amaze us. So, I think, we all want to see what he's going to keep doing, although I'm a Yankee fan, so I hate to see the Dodgers keep winning and collecting all-stars. I think it seems like they got enough now. And I'm very interested to see how they enjoy the deferred payments when he's retired and they're paying him $68 million a year to not play anymore.
Well, the Yankee fans, certainly know about being the team that everybody looks at, like the Dodgers are now, going, "Oh, they spend them all the money and all that." It's probably a little weird for Yankee fans to have the shoe on the other foot for a change and have them look at the Dodgers that way.
There's a new evil empire, yes.
Yeah, I thought it was the Mets actually, and I wrote about that a while back too, because Steve Cohen seems to be the axis of evil for a lot of people.
Well,
Uh,
he's trying. They've got Juan Soto, and it was an interesting Subway series.
yes, it
So,
was. It
Oh
was.
yeah.
as Mets fans, you're probably not happy that Soto didn't get on the All-Star team. He was as deserving as any of the other outfielders. So there's still time. There's injuries and stuff, but the Yankee fans miss him. He's a spectacular player, and I think all the Mets fans are going to enjoy having him and seeing his Hall of Fame career play out.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about Johnny Ward. And Gordon and I had a pet project with John Montgomery Ward because we just find him to be one of the most interesting guys in baseball history, given his the aspects that out off the field with trying to organize the players, union wise and all that stuff. But as a two-way player, and he kind of didn't do it at exactly the same time the way that some of the others, but was excellent, as you point out in the book, at both pitching and hitting at various points in his career.
Yeah, and I think he was really the first baseball superstar. And he was when he was pitching, it was a different time. I think he started out pitching from 45 feet, and he was pitching underhand. So it's hard to relate that to what Ohtani's doing now, but he was dominant as a pitcher in those early days. And then when the mound got moved back, and when they were allowed to pitch overhand, he kind of threw his arm out. And so he interestingly switched to center field and taught himself to throw left-handed because his right arm was sore. And then he could play a little bit of second base and still throw righty because it wasn't as far a throw. And then he taught himself to be a switch hitter because he was afraid of the ball, which is he's probably the only guy in the Hall of Fame who's admitted that he was afraid of getting hit by a pitch ball. But when they started throwing overhand and you didn't have a batting helmet and the shin guards and this other stuff, it hurt when you got hit. So
You don't have the full array of armor that the
that's
guys are
right.
wearing
Yeah.
today.
So yeah, he had some really dominant stats as a pitcher. I think he's still the youngest pitcher to throw a perfect game. He was 20 years old, and I think he was the first pitcher to hit 2 home runs in a game. And back in those days, no one was hitting home runs. So, but he transitioned from pitching to hitting, and really carved out an even nicer career as a shortstop and a position player. All along the way, he was stealing bases. He was playing uh, pretty spectacularly in the field. He was one of the first players to use kind of like a thin glove. So he would only be making 60 errors a year instead of 80 errors a year at shortstop. And he was a manager at the age of 22. They called him captains then, basically, but he was calling the shots. So just everything about his career, from what he did as a player to starting the first players union, and all the other
Uh-oh.
things he got involved in, starting the Players League. Just a real pioneer in the sport, and obviously a two-way superstar. But he did a lot more than just pitch and bat.
He was really impressive just because of his ability to sort of command both sides of the play. And I think he still holds the all-time record for lowest career like on base percentage as a pitcher, which
Yeah,
is just
yeah.
which when you think about pitching underhand for the majority of his career is a pretty impressive achievement because not a lot of people could be able to hit that.
Right, right. All those stats are kind of out of whack, and there's a lot of balls getting hit, and the fielders didn't have gloves, so but yeah, he wasn't giving up a lot of runs, and uh, he was pitching most of the innings. His first few years in the league, he was pitching almost every single day. I mean, the day he pitched a perfect game, he pitched the day before a complete game. So you're just not going to see that anymore. So yeah, but everything he did, he was such a leader among the players and trying to get more rights for the players. He kind of he's playing baseball, and during the season and in the off season, he's going to law school and he's getting 2 degrees, which, that's impressive enough. But he got smart enough and he realized the owners were taking advantage of the players, and he tried really hard to get more rights. He was successful in some areas and getting extra rights for players. And he was about 100 years ahead of Marvin Miller in knowing what the players needed to do to band together to combat what the owners were doing against them.
He was ahead of his time in such a way, and I think so many of these guys, because you see these guys back then and the way teams used them, it was kind of interesting how they almost regressed over time. Because even when we look at you look at the old way of doing things, you had John Montgomery Ward, he went from being a pitcher to being a hitter. It kind of speaks to how hard it is, but how I think teams are looking, because you only ended up with a couple modern examples of guys like Rick Ankiel and Michael Lorenzen, who were guys that were treated as both hitting prospects and pitching prospects. And in Ankiel's case, it kind of only became a hitter once he flamed out as a pitcher.
Yeah, and that's really been the case for, I think, most of the 20th century. I mean, even guys like Smokey Joe Wood, he had one of the best pitching seasons ever, and then he threw his arm out. He took a year off and then turned into a pretty good outfielder, but he was never really a two-way player. And it just got too hard. I mean, once Babe Ruth came around and he was only a two-way player for 2 years, and when he was traded to the Yankees, he would have been very resistant if they tried to make him a two-way player and had him keep pitching. He hated it. He said it was too much, and he enjoyed batting. And when he was a two-way player and or just pitching, he hated sitting. I mean, he hated only playing every 4 or 5 days, and because he grew up at St. Mary's boys' school playing baseball all day, every day, year round.
He was a catcher some of the time.
Yeah, yeah, and he played all 9 positions there. He was a left-handed catcher, and he would pitch. He would do it all. And then he goes and with the Red Sox, and he's just a pitcher, and that bored the crap out of him. So when he went to the Yankees, he was thrilled that he got to play every day. And I think the interesting thing about his Yankees career, he pitched 5 times. He won all 5 of those games, and that's it for his pitching career with the Yankees.
There's a lot of times that those last games of the season he would pitch,
Right.
for the
Right. Yeah, I can't even imagine, just, you haven't pitched in a year, but hey, can you give us 9? Sure, why not?
Yeah, sure, I could do that. Not too hard.
Right.
I did a little story on one of the players you mentioned in your book on Cy Seymour. And I call him the other Cy because everybody knows, the more famous of the two Cys. But Cy Seymour was also one of those two-way players and kind of had an interesting career as well.
Yeah, well, he started out as a pitcher and he had some success, except he was wild. And, he had too many walks, but he was kind of a good hitting pitcher. And so he transitioned to become a really good outfielder. He had a long career, had a lot of hits. And I think he and Babe Ruth are the only players to have over 100 games pitched and 1,500 hits in their careers. So, that's impressive. And there were a bunch of guys like that. I mean, George Sisler was he was a spectacular ace quality pitcher in college and starting out in the minors. And then he had a little success as a batter. And next thing you know, he's going to the Hall of Fame as a position player, but he was a good pitcher early on. So there was a lot of guys that kind of switched from one to the other, but you just didn't see the consistent year in and year out of being a two-way player once the 19th century guys kind of transitioned because of the mound being changed and other changes. When you're throwing overhand and you're throwing from 60 feet, you can't pitch every game anymore.
Right. I used I wrote about Cy Seymour. I also wrote about Lefty O'Doul, and I always joke that when I was in college, we used to go to the bar in San Francisco that bore his name, Lefty O'Doul's. But Lefty O'Doul was a very good pitcher, and then actually went out of baseball for 5 years before he came back as a hitter. And he's got the highest average of any major league player at 349 that is not in the Hall of Fame, who played that many years. And
yeah, and you kind of think if he had spent his whole career as a position player without those missing years, he probably would have been in the Hall of Fame, because you assume he would have been pretty close to 349 career average and compiled some more stats. So he certainly had a very impressive career, a great batter. And, yeah, there's some guys like that that are kind of outliers that you see the two-way ability, but you just don't see it like you're seeing with Ohtani now. It's so impressive because it's apples and oranges comparing Babe Ruth to Ohtani, and Babe Ruth was essentially facing, the same 15, 20 pitchers all year. There weren't 30 teams in the league, and each team had 13 guys, and there was all these analytics. He was facing the same guys, and it's fastballs and curveballs. He wasn't seeing a lot of spin, and it just wasn't as challenging. He knew what someone's going to throw him, and they weren't throwing 100 miles an hour. And not to, obviously he was so much better than his peers, but what Otani's doing is he's the analytics are trying to prepare pitchers for how to face him. And I think he's pretty hard to pitch to, but at least they've got all the data on, well, here's how you can get him out, and here's what to do with 2 strikes. And, it's just a different game with all the analytics involved. And that's why it's so impressive. They can keep showing up day after day and performing like that.
But he's thrown a couple of pitches this season already, and you mentioned he's only kind of acting as an opener right now while he builds himself up at over 100 miles an hour. And I keep thinking he's going to break. He's going to break. You can't do that to a human being and have him excel at those two things. And so the limited innings is the only thing I think that's saving him right now, because to think of him as a 32 start guy or 30 start guy over a full season and DH, was like, that's, to me, he's done it, and it's still unimaginable to me.
Yeah, and I think that's what, I mean, a lot of his peers are saying and thinking, and not all of them say it out loud, is because every position player knows what they go through every day just to get ready to play and to recover from the previous day's game. And the same thing with a pitcher. I mean, the exertion to pitch even if you only go 6 or 7 innings, to pitch every 5 days it takes a lot. And to do both is, I mean they can't wrap their head around that concept. It's just, and it's, you're preparing in different ways. And early in his career with the Angels, it was looking like every time he got injured, I mean, he wasn't as good a batter when he wasn't doing both. And that's why, last year was the first year when he was just batting that he had just an out of this world season. He's obviously made some adjustments to that. And now as he ages in his 30s, it's not going to get easier to pitch. So
Right.
lots of people have said, if he was just batting, would he be the best batter of all time? Possibly. And the same thing, if he was just a pitcher, would his career rank as one of the best pitchers of all time? And it's almost, you almost wish you could see that. Instead, we're going to see someone who may be close to both of those, and just kind of a unicorn.
I think number 99 in the Yankees might have something to say about that, by the way, as far as.
Well, yeah, that's true.
I mean, it is impressive. We were recently listening to Ron Darling, who calling the Met games, and he was talking about all of the things that he would have to do in terms of the running that he would do between all the long tossing he would do in between starts. But if you're playing in the games like Ohtani is, you don't have time to go on a 6 mile run during the game while everybody's just sitting there, because you're batting, you're up third. They need you in the game, and so that it is just the level of preparation. We talk about, Pete Alonso is skipping the home run derby this year, in part because he wants to focus on the season that he's having and not do the home run derby. And so when you're looking at these guys trying to manage themselves through a full course of a season, basically nobody's done a full 162 game season doing both and not broken down, at least in, since 1920, basically.
Yeah, but I know a lot of Ohtani's Dodgers teammates are amazed at his routine, and he does a lot of things that are different from the rest of the team. He's kind of got his own routine, and they just sit and marvel at what he's doing. There's all these really special exercises and conditioning things he does, and they just, I mean, they don't know how to relate to it. Obviously, he's figured out what works best for him. But it's when he was in Japan, I mean, he was baseball 24/7, and that's all he thought about. That's all he worked at, and really dedicated himself to the sport. And it's certainly paid off. It's amazing to see. And I kind of wish I was able to see the Negro League players back in the day and really see Bullet Rogan day after day, and Leon Day and Double Duty Radcliffe and some of those guys. And we really didn't get the opportunity to see them in the same context that we saw Babe Ruth. And there's videos and there's photos, and so many people got to see Babe Ruth play, and it's just not the same with the Negro League players. And that's I think one of the shames, and ultimately what I wasn't able to do in the book was say these guys were better than those guys. It's really comparing apples and oranges. And so what I, ultimately when I was writing the book, I was trying to come up with who's the greatest two-way player in baseball history, and I didn't go in with any preconceived notions. And I think the jury's still out that Ohtani can certainly run away with that title by the end of his career. But I kind of looked at it differently in that Ruth is probably considered the best two-way player in the segregated major leagues. Montgomery Ward would be the best two-way player in the 19th century. Martin Digo would be the best two-way player in the Latin leagues. Bullet Rogan, the best two-way player in the Negro Leagues, and then Ohtani in the post-integration era. And I thought that's the best, fairest way to look at it, rather than just lumping them all together like they're all playing at the same era, because they're just not, and it's apples and oranges.
And it takes a special human, as we all know, to do that, because it's not like there's anybody in the wings that you're hearing about, whether it's, at any other level, right? You don't hear about, there's no crazy college kid who's been doing this in college and just killing it with everybody, or even in the minor leagues. Like, he is the unicorn for that reason, that it's just not the kind of thing you work into. You either are it or you're not.
Yeah, and I think the great thing about Ohtani, he's opening up minds, and I think there's more managers in high school and college and the minors, maybe the majors, who are more receptive to having a two-way player. And I think 2 years ago, there were 8 guys that were drafted out of college that were two-way players, and some of them were going to be given a chance to be two-way players. And Kegley known on the Royals that they said they were going to give him a shot. Well, the problem was he was a year away from being ready for the majors as a position player. He's a great slugger. He was probably 4 years away as a pitcher. So they said, we don't have 4 years to wait on him. So they just turned him into a one-way player. But he probably had the ability. And even guys like Lorenzen, when he was a free agent a year ago, he said, I can be a guy out of the bullpen and a center fielder for you. And I thought, that's perfect. Rosters are short. Here's a guy that can fill 2 roles for you. He's not going to be an everyday player, maybe, but, once a week he can be center fielder or a pinch hitter, and he can come out of the bullpen. And, he got signed and he's just being used as a pitcher. But I think it's a missed opportunity to, not an Ohtani quality player, but someone that can fill 2 roles for you on your team is very valuable.
I think your point there about like the way the teams look at these players is so important. Why we're not going to see more and more of these two-way players is that the developmental times is if you've got a guy that's a year away from being ready as a major league hitter, and he might be 2-3 years away from being ready as a pitcher, are you really going to take the time to develop him as a pitcher when he might not develop fully? Because that just happens. Some guys try and develop and they never get there. Or are you going to be like, okay, well, he's ready now as a batter. Let's get him up there. And we know he's useful at that right now. And that can flip flop, but I think teams are never going to give, have that level of patience you would need.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. And even my son Brandon, he was a two-way player in high school. He was a pitcher, and then when he wasn't pitching, he played center field. That happened his first 2 years in high school, and then the junior year, the coach just said, "Oh, you're a pitcher now." And he's like, "What? I want to play center field." And I'm like, "I want to go and watch him play every day." And that just happens. Coaches make that determination. And I think, like I said, I think Ohtani has shown that you don't put people in a box because they might surprise you. And I think you're seeing, some college teams do that, and a few guys in the minors do it. But there's so many pieces to the equation that it's a valuable asset, and doing both tends to diminish the returns on either of those. So they kind of focus on the one skill that they think they're going to be best at.
I think it was Hall of Famer Dave Winfield, who pitched in college, and he was also a basketball player for what that's worth. Before he became a baseball player, a major league player, he said, "Look, you have to do twice as much training, right? You're training as a pitcher, you're training as a position player and hitter, and then you've got the study. You've got twice as much study to do as everything else." So
Yeah.
he himself is amazed at Ohtani for the idea of what he's got to do to be able to be ready to pitch to all these hitters, to be able to face all these pitchers and do the preparation or double the preparation that everybody else has to do.
Yeah, yeah, that's just one of the many impressive things about him. And yeah, it's very interesting to see how much he's able to pitch, and if they get him fully built up by the playoffs, and then kind of unleash him in a 7-game series. I mean, I think everyone's going to want to see that.
Yeah, well, Dodger pitchers only pitch 3 innings anyway, so
Well, I don't know how they can. I mean, every day there's another transaction, and they're getting rid of one pitcher and bringing up another one. It's like, man, that 40-man roster is it's written in pencil, that's for sure. But I think one of the biggest thrills was watching Ohtani face Trout in the World Baseball Classic.
agreed.
Oh, man, who wouldn't pay to see that every day? And
Yeah.
how many times has Mike Trout whiffed on 3 pitches and said, "Well, that guy was better than me today," and it's very thrilling.
Maybe we'll see that with perhaps Freddie Freeman and Mookie Betts playing for the U.S. if they're going to play on the WBC team next spring, and Ohtani for Japan. We could see teammates again facing each other
Yeah,
with things
yeah.
like that.
And Judge is going to be on that team, so yeah, that would be exciting.
Something to see. We didn't ask you this to start, but we're going to do it now, and that is your background, Chris. We probably should have asked you this at the beginning. I mean, I know you've done some work with Saber, but talk a little bit about your background and you came through. Is this the only book you've written, or what else have you done with that?
Baseball's Two-Way Greats is my second book, and my first book came out in 2012, and it was a 5-year labor of love that nearly killed me because I was working a full-time job, and then I'd come home and I'd work till midnight on it, and then all these stats were rattling around my brain, and I couldn't get to sleep for 3 hours. So, and then I'd have to get up and go to my day job, and so my first book was called Baseball State by State, and it was all-time teams by player state of birth. And I had a lot of fun with that, but it was also all the historic places to visit in each state, player nicknames by each state.
Oh,
And I
cool.
got 2.5 years into it, and I thought, how can I have an all-time team for players from Georgia and Josh Gibson isn't the catcher? Because I didn't have the Negro League guys in. So I said, I've got to put the Negro League guys in.
Oh, wow.
And that added a couple of years of, and I
Yeah.
was familiar with the Negro League players then. And the stats back then weren't as good as they are now with the Seamheads Negro League database. So that was a really hard part of it. But just like I'm live in Indianapolis now, so from Indiana, who's the best all-time first baseman from Indiana? Gil Hodges or Don Mattingly? I mean, I went back and forth on that. And even as a Yankee player, Mattingly isn't a slam dunk there. So just exciting things like that. And then I would try and explain why I picked one player over another. And so that was the first book. And Two-Way Greats is my second book. I've got a third book that I finished in February that I think is scheduled to be released next March, called Tragedy in Black Baseball. And while I was working on both my first 2 books, I kept coming across all these Negro League players that died too young and kind of tragic deaths. Everyone knows Josh Gibson and even Rube Foster and people like that. But I kept coming across all these Negro League players that were dying of tuberculosis or a car accident or some other illness. And so I just kept a little file. And when I started the book, I thought I had maybe 50 or 60 players. Well, it turned out there were close to 200. And I was only able to find room for 136 of them, but it tells the stories of these Negro League players that died tragically at early ages. And I think one of the ones that as a player I knew nothing about that I really enjoyed learning about was Octavius Catto, who died in 1871. He was assassinated on Election Day. It was the first day blacks had the right to vote. And he was assassinated in Philadelphia because all the whites were upset that the blacks were voting, and he was kind of a pioneer in black baseball. and to learn about the circumstances of his death was again, it was just a player and a person I wasn't familiar with. He was kind of the Martin Luther King Jr. of the 19th century. So I learned a lot in putting that book together, and I'm really excited to see that come out next year.
We look forward to taking a look at that one when it comes out too, Chris. That's a very interesting subject. But we want to thank you for joining us. And like Gordon said, we both enjoyed the book is entitled Baseball's Two-Way Greats, Pitching and Batting Stars from Ruth to Rogan to Ohtani. The author is Chris Jensen. You can get this book anywhere you get your books from, whether it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or any other of the outlets. And Chris, thanks so much for joining us. We hope to talk to you again.
Thank you so much, Mark and Gordon. Appreciate talking baseball with you.
Yeah, great.